But one of the names that loads of people will know that has been confirmed from the Biden administration is Evan Gershkovich. Tell us a bit about the campaign to see him freed.
Yeah, Evan is a journalist. Evan, like me, was accredited to work in Russia. I was expelled sometime later after the invasion of Ukraine. He was arrested and accused of espionage whilst he was doing his job as a journalist in the city of Ekaterinburg. Now, he and his friends and his family and his newspaper, his employer, have always been absolutely adamant that the charges against him, as they have described it, are absurd, that he's not a spy, that he is a journalist, and his arrest, they argue very firmly, is simply a sign of the crackdown on free speech and free expression and on the freedom of the press inside Russia, and that he himself was always a hostage, a political hostage, taken because Russia wanted to trade. And ultimately, that is what's happened. He spent more than a year in prison, a young journalist, extremely ambitious, just in a newish job with the Wall Street Journal, extremely good at that job. He was then arrested. As I say, it now looks like he is going to be heading home. And I know there have been a huge number of his friends, other journalists, people who work with him in Moscow and elsewhere, who have been campaigning, getting people to write letters, translating those letters tirelessly. Even one of his friends reading books together with him in prison, sending books to him and then reading them together so that they could discuss those books. Anything to try to make the time go faster, because he was convicted and sentenced to a 16-year prison term in Russia. So as it turns out, he's served just over a year. But of course, every day of that must have been agony, both for him and for his relatives and friends.
Sarah, stay with us. Sarah Rainsford there in Berlin. Sarah has deep detail and knowledge of this story, as does our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who is with me now. Frank, what are you hearing?
This is the most extraordinary breakthrough in prisoner swaps. I mean, one of the most extraordinary in recent history, I think. Probably the biggest one since 2010, when 14 people were released in a prisoner exchange. Remember that this involves several countries: Russia, the US, Germany, potentially Belarus, Slovenia and Britain. And somehow behind the scenes, at a time when the West is helping Ukraine to fight a full-scale war with Russia, contacts have been maintained between intelligence sources, and it looks like the omens are pretty good for a full-scale prisoner exchange. Now, it's very important to say it hasn't happened yet, but the fact that the White House is confirming that it's on the cards, it's being planned, and they have named people is pretty significant. But these things can sometimes break down right at the last minute. Less so when it's nations involved, more so when it's kidnapping by bandits and so on. But it's fascinating that clearly, despite the incredibly bad relations between the West and Russia, as Sarah Rainsford was mentioning there, both sides want something out of this. So the West, particularly the US, considers that Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan and others are innocents who are simply being used as political pawns to trade for people who, for one reason or another, the West has imprisoned. And one of the people that Russia definitely wants back is somebody called Vadim Krasikov. He's an FSB colonel, so that's one of the 3 Russian intelligence agencies. He's been sentenced, he's been given a life sentence in Germany for the murder in a Berlin park of a Chechen-Georgian dissident. It was known as the bicycle murder. He was shot at close range. This character, Krasikov, dumped a wig that he was wearing and the weapon into the river nearby, but they were recovered. He was arrested, charged and sentenced. And President Putin has actually alluded to him in that so-called interview that he did with Tucker Carlson some months ago, in which he said he's a Russian patriot and words to the effect of, we'd like him back.
Frank, Sarah was very clear in pointing out that we shouldn't read too much into it in terms of the fact that the Kremlin has had to cooperate with other nation states that they would perceive as being their enemies. But nonetheless, it is extraordinary that we are seeing some kind of collective alignment or working together to make this happen.
Yeah, I mean, she's absolutely right, of course, that, this is not a sign of weakness or of Russia giving in or of the West giving in. Both sides want something. It's transactional. Nobody's doing anybody any favours here. This is a case, a rare case, if it works, of the alignment of interests despite that. And one of the things that surprised me was that the chief of both the chief of the CIA, William Burns, and the chief of Britain's MI6, they do have intermittent but fairly frequent conversations with their opposite numbers in Russia, despite the fact there's a full-scale war going on and that Putin often says that this is a war for Russia's survival and so on. It certainly is a war for Ukraine's survival. And yet you've got William Burns and Sir Richard Moore having conversations from time to time with Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of the SVR, that is the Russian overseas intelligence gathering arm of the Kremlin. And often there are sort of common interests, and there are things which can only be thrashed out in somewhere like Ankara or Istanbul, some kind of neutral territory where both sides feel comfortable.
So how much do you actually know, Frank, about how this works? It's obviously incredibly complex, very sensitive. It involves lots of people. What would we imagine the process is, or how much do we know?
I'd love to be able to tell you that, you know, there's masses I know and I can't tell you. The truth is, we don't yet know. I don't know the ins and outs details. They haven't come out about this yet, but it will certainly involve not only intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA would be heavily involved in this, but also there is a US hostage sort of team, hostage release team that would be very much involved in this. And interestingly, at the Aspen Security Conference recently, Jake Sullivan, who is the US National Security Advisor, did mention that efforts were underway, and he said, I am certain we are going to get Evan back, or words to that effect. So clearly things were already underway there. Usually they are brokered by an intermediary country. So if you look at countries like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they've all managed to negotiate prisoner exchanges between Ukraine and Russia, or similar countries, because they've got good relations with both the West and with Moscow. So when Russia did its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Western countries, I think, were a bit presumptuous in sort of saying, well, of course, the whole world condemns this. No, it didn't. There's a large body of the world which has rather sort of said, you know what, this is Europe's problem. We're going to keep good relations with Russia because it's an important country. We want its oil. We like to keep relations open with it because of defense or because of oil. And those countries include very important nations in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, which have got excellent relations with Moscow, which is why we've seen some prisoner releases organised by them. And it may well be that there is an element there, but we don't know that yet. We don't know exactly who brokered this. As I say, there's a lot of moving parts in this. It involves, if all the people who both sides want out of custody, if they all end up getting released, this will be the most extraordinary, complex and successful prisoner release that I can think of in the last 14 years, since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.